So we shall start. Today's lecture is going to be rip-roaring. I have a lot of material to get through, and I'm completely caffeinated, so if I go very fast, someone has to jump up or wave to me and say, slow down. For those of you who just come into the room, where the rest of us have been watching Radiohead play the national anthem, and I thought that would be a good occasion to tell you that that isn't actually the national anthem of the United Kingdom. The actual national anthem is called God Save the Queen, which the Sex Pistols, of course, did a great take on in the 1970s, but actually is a song that became popular in the middle of the 18th century, in 1744, 1745. The song was first published then, and it became popular in the aftermath of the attempt of James II's son, the so-called Bonnie Prince Charles, the Pretender, to try and land a French-supported army to reconquer Britain and re-establish the Stuart dynasty in Britain, which is something I'm going to be talking about a little bit today. And I should also let you know that the Union Jack that you see here was originally developed in the early 17th century when James VI of Scotland became James I of England and Ireland in 1603, but it wasn't formally adopted as the flag of Great Britain and Ireland until the union with Ireland in 1801. So the story that I'm going to be telling you today is of the development of a new type of state in Britain and the construction of a new type of nation state and a new type of imperial state in the during the 18th century. And this is a pretty remarkable development in lots of ways. We have to start by remembering that during the 17th century, the British Isles had basically been torn apart by civil wars, by rebellions, and by revolutions. Many of those events were bloody and brutal. During the First Civil War in England, between 1642 and 1646, 14% of adult males died. That's a higher proportion than died in the First World War. And during the English invasion of Ireland in 1649 to 1653 under Oliver Cromwell, something like 25 to 50% of the Irish population perished. This was a bloody and traumatic century, the 17th century. And at issue in many of these conflicts was the very legitimacy of the state. Should a monarch or parliament rule? Who had the authority to raise taxes and armies? Should the state have the right to prescribe the religious practice of their subjects, whether Catholic or Protestant? And how could Scotland and Ireland resist or be incorporated within the English state? When the so-called Glorious Revolution occurred in 1688, when basically a bunch of Whig aristocrats in Parliament enacted a coup d'etat that displaced the Catholic King James II, with his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange, Protestants, few were sanguine that peace and stability were going to be established. And yet, by 1819, when this lecture is going to end, the British state had become the most secure and arguably the most powerful in the world. It had transformed itself into the United Kingdom with the Act of Union with Scotland and Ireland in 1707 and 1801, and it had fought an almost perpetual series of wars with its continental rivals, culminating with their defeat in the during the Napoleonic Wars and the final settlement at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. During that century, Britain had also established itself as an imperial state. It had extended its imperial territories across the Caribbean, North America, South Asia, and the Pacific. Now, not everything was plain sailing here. This was a deeply contentious process that generated a good deal of political conflict and unrest, as we're going to see today. Now, there traditionally have been two ways of thinking about this process. The first is to emphasize the exceptionalism of Britain, that only Britain was able to achieve this type of miracle of establishing a new type of politically stable imperial state. The old Whig version, which basically grew out of the Revolution of 1688, is that the British had a peculiar genius for stability and compromise. It was part of a sort of national characteristics that allowed Britain to achieve this stable state. In contrast, the Marxist version that grew up, or the leftist version that grew up to critique that Whig version, saw it as being founded on a history of state coercion and repression. Historians have more recently developed an argument that has suggested that Britain really isn't that exceptional at all, that actually it looked very much like many other European powers. What distinguished it, however, was its ability to develop what is called a fiscal military state, to basically raise taxes that supported its military and territorial ambitions overseas, and the fierce nationalism that was generated by the hatred of Catholic Europe, of Protestant Britain's hatred of Catholic Europe. Now, the story that I'm going to tell today has elements of all of those stories put together. I'm not going to be telling you that this was an inevitable process. I'm going to be emphasizing instead that it was a highly contingent one, full of conflict, that actually the state remained remarkably insecure for a very long time, and that actually bred an enormous amount of repression and the use of the military capacities of the state to secure itself. Certainly by the end of this period, this image of the Leviathan, which comes from the frontispiece of Thomas Hobbes' book of that name, of this great monstrous figure of the state with a sceptre in one hand and a sword in the other rising over the countryside, was very much achieved by 1819. I've lost my mouse. There we go. Okay, so now let me talk to you about this war-mongering, tax-hungry state and how it was established. As I've suggested, on Tuesday, the revolutionary settlement that developed between 1688 and 1714 sought to resolve the very legitimacy of that new fledgling state. it sought to do a number of things. It sought to try and figure out the rules and the order of succession, and to insist that these were to be determined by Parliament, not by the monarchy. It sought also to constrain the executive power of the monarch by making it a constitutional monarchy that had to act in coordination with Parliament. And the monarchy became dependent upon Parliament for its ability to raise tax revenue to carry out the business of government. And by establishing the Bill of Rights in 1689 to insist that the judicial system would remain separate, and to try and establish the claim that sovereignty rested with the people through Parliament. Another key element of this revolutionary settlement was to insist upon the nature and extent of religious toleration, given that religious wars had torn the country apart over the preceding century and a half. And the Acts of Toleration insisted upon the integrity of the established Anglican Church, the established Protestant Church, Church of the State, but allowed nonconformist Protestants the right to worship, while at the same time banning Catholics and nonconformist dissenters from public office and subjecting them to the taxes of the Anglican Church. All of this in the Act of Toleration of 1689. And finally, the revolutionary settlement sought to figure out the relationship between England, Ireland, and Scotland. But that settlement was a bunch of compromises that masked continuing tensions and potential conflict. Conflict between the Whigs in Parliament who believed that sovereignty rested with the people, who had the right to resist the sovereign, inspired by Locke's two treatises on government of 1689, and Tories who continued to believe in the divine right of kings and the primacy of the Stuart dynasty. Tensions also between nonconformists and Anglicans. Nonconformists had the right to worship, but they continued to be barred from certain offices and from a university education at Oxford and Cambridge and the other universities. Tensions also between England, Scotland and Ireland. Ireland had been invaded by William of Orange in order to flush out James II, who had fled there after the Revolution of 1688, and he was not defeated until, or his forces were not defeated until 1699. And then a whole series of repressive measures were introduced to assure the ascendancy in Ireland of the minority Protestant population, excluding Catholics from Parliament and from public office, including the army, excluding not allowing Catholics to possess firearms or to buy or inherit property. And tensions between those primarily in England, in northern England and in Scotland, between those eager to restore James II to the throne, the so-called Jacobites, who continued to forge rebellions in 1694, and then again up in the Scottish Highlands in 1715, 1742, and 1744, 1745. All of this took place in the context of continuing threats of invasion from the Catholic monarchical regimes of France, Spain, and the Austrian Habsburgs. So this was a state struggling to establish itself, not just its internal legitimacy, but its security with the constituent elements of the nation and its rival European powers. In short, the prospects for survival were not looking particularly good. And war would be a continuing feature of this state's attempt to try and secure itself, and war depended upon the ability to raise a lot of money. So how was this made possible? How did the state gather the money it needed to fight these wars? Basically, through the creation of something that our governments now tell us is a very bad thing, which is the idea of the national debt. Two key innovations made the creation of the national debt possible. The first is the creation of the Bank of England in 1694. The bank was formed when the new revolutionary state was on the very edge of bankruptcy, and the possibility of French invasion was very real, and it had run out of money. So what it did was ask for a loan of £1.2 million from this new entity, which in return was given limited liability and the right to issue banknotes. Okay? So it was a deal, basically, between, effectively, a bunch of creditors and the state in return for the right to establish a bank and to give it certain monopolies. 1.2 million was a lot of money. So in order to service its debts, the state had to raise taxes to pay off the interest. And this was not an easy job. Raising taxes had been part of the reason why the Stuart monarchy had had so much trouble in the 17th century. So at first what they do is cobble together a series of temporary measures of raising money through bonds and securities, of national lotteries and so forth, and a whole host of different types of taxes. Taxes on windows, on horses, on dogs, on the numbers of women servants you have, any number of things, of temporary solutions. But basically, by around the beginning of the 18th century, they settle upon a system. And that system had three principal parts. Land tax, which sometimes could amount to up to 20%. Customs duties on the import of goods from overseas. There have been between 1690 and 1760, there was something like 800 Acts of Parliament regarding customs, and between 1760 and 1830, there were an additional 1,300 Acts of Parliament. Lastly, and probably most importantly, was an indirect sales tax, known as the excise. And the excise was gradually expanded over an increasing number of commodities, like beer, like wine, like spirits, soap, coal, coffee, and, of course, tobacco. Now, what's new about this tax was that it was collected in a different type of way. It wasn't collected as customs and land tax were by local assessors, who very often tended to be gentry figures, who could therefore negotiate with their peers how much money they owed the state. It was a sort of individual bargain between the assessor and the taxpayer. Instead, it was collected by a centrally coordinated office, the Excise Office, the Board of Excise, who appointed salaried officers who were afforded certain districts in the country and travelled around those districts collecting taxes. There were over 2,000 of these excise men by 1708. And so effective was this system that it accounted for an increasing percentage of overall government revenue. 29% in 1710 and 52% by 1795. 29% in 1710, 52% by 1795. Altogether, the tax burden on the British population increased 16 times between 1660 and 1850. And that's while its national income only tripled. The only other country that came close to this type of tax burden was the Dutch. Now, that was the fiscal component of this fiscal military state. But the fiscal military state also created something that looks very much like a military-industrial complex, and it occurred around the development of the armed forces. That first loan from the Bank of England had been used to fortify the navy to protect the country from French invasion. An enormous amount of money was poured into the navy and to the army during the 18th century. Between 1700 and 1750, the navy manpower and tonnage doubled in size. It was estimated in 1715 that the size of the fleet represented a capital investment of £2.25 million, and maintaining it took £500,000 a year. And that was just the cost of the ships. The major dockyards, like this one you see behind you on the Thames, the Chatham dockyards, were built to build and repair and maintain these enormous ships. The major dockyards employed 8,000 men by 1770. 2,000 men were hired at Portsmouth and Plymouth each. That made it by far the biggest employee in the country, by a mile. But when the early woolen and textile mills developed, they often employ like 150 or 200 people. This is a giant industrial enterprise. And the numbers of people aboard those ships also grow dramatically. So at the height of the Seven Years' War in the 1760s, there were 80,000 Britons on board the naval ships. That meant that the supply chain was huge. They consumed, these people on board the ships, in the 1760s, 4 million pounds of flour, 11 million pounds of beef, over 4.5 million pounds of biscuits, and 2.5 million pounds of cheese. Not even Costco would have been able to supply the British Navy. And then we're not even talking about the supply of the wood, of the metals, etc., the sales that were needed to keep the Navy in business. The Army is a very similar story. You see behind you the growth in the size of the Army. I've taken these figures from the 9 Years' War from 1689 to 1697, the War of Spanish Succession from 1702 to 13, the American War of 1775 to 83, and the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 1815. And the Army also depends upon the hiring of foreign troops and mercenaries. 25% of the Army's budget during the 7 Years' War went on hiring local allies and mercenaries. So, in 1757, when Britain wins the decisive battle in South Asia, called the Battle of Plassey, it was fought with just 750 British soldiers. The rest were basically hired Indian sepoys from their local allies. Overall, then, military expenditure on the Army and the Navy accounted for over half of all government expenditure during the 18th century, and reached a peak of 70% in the decade in the decade of the 7 Years' War. Now, this describes an incredibly powerful state, and I don't want you to be fooled into thinking that was the case. This may have seemed an incredible state, but in many ways it remained very fragile. It remained a composite type of state, a highly decentralized state made up of many different parts. The new fiscal military apparatus was grafted on top of an older structure. So, for instance, just to give you I'm going to give you a series of examples of this. So one of the first things that they do is begin to develop roads in order to get the military around the countryside quicker in order to control local populations. And they first do that in the 1720s through the 1740s to build a big road up to Scotland to make sure the Jacobite threat is not realised. But nonetheless, by 1760, it still took 2 whole weeks to get from London to Edinburgh by road. Okay? Bear in mind also that, and I'm now going to talk about law and order, that basically Britain has had no effective police force. Local areas might have a local watchman, there might be even a parish constable, but there was no centralised police system. Instead, what there was a standing army that had been allowed in the so-called Disbanding Act of 1699. If you want to create a standing army, very good idea to give it a name to seem like you're actually getting rid of one. So the Disbanding Act actually allows for the maintenance of a standing army, and there was about 15,000 people in that standing army, and they were all basically mobile horse regiments to allow them to move around the country to put out fires, not literally to put out fires, but to put out disorder and rebellion wherever it was needed. The Riot Act of 1716 enabled local magistrates, so-called justices of the peace, to read a riot act when the disorder was fermenting and then summon in the local regiment to put it down. So in 1757, 20 regiments were deployed to suppress riots all across the country. And most famously, in this image you see behind me, during the Gordon riots of 1780, 12,000 troops were needed to suppress the rioting that broke out. It was an anti-Catholic riot that broke out over 5 or 6 days in London. Now, there weren't any methods of crowd control. Okay? There wasn't a pepper spray a la UC Davis. There wasn't any highly developed forms of crowd control. Instead, what they did was basically issue warnings, charge at crowds on horseback, and fire shots at them. And very often, when they failed to disperse, then real shots were fired at them. 285 people died during the Gordon riots as a consequence of troops firing upon them. It's also important to emphasise that the centralised state outside of the revenue departments were incredibly small. There was really very few government employees outside of those revenue offices. So, to give you an example, there were only 150 departments, only 150 employees in those so-called civilian departments in 1688. By 1750, that had risen to 2,500, but still, particular ministries had very few people. The Board of Trade in 1815 had just 20 officials in it. The Home Office, at the same time, had just 17. The Foreign Office had 30. Okay, these are huge government state departments, and they're manned by very few people. The basic unit of government tended to be local, okay, and it tended to be done at the level of the parish or the town. There were around 200 towns that boasted